Thank you very much. Um, the title, as advertised, I think, is prefaced by the language "Writing Matters." Can you all hear me? Okay. I believe that the "Writing Matters," which is a lovely double entendre, is also a ruse, because this is a more subversive and antagonistic title that reflects the political realities in the United States at the moment. And I believe that we were wondering when we made the Fulbright proposal whether if we told the Fulbright people who have to sign off on this that we were going to discuss this topic, whether they would sink the proposal. So the language, the cover language, was designed to distract the Fulbright supervisors. Now, if I find that when we land in San Francisco on the way home, we are met by FBI agents, you'll know that our cover has been blown. But that won't be your problem, but I can maybe smuggle you out some notes from jail. I have two epigraphs for this talk. One is, I'm sure, one that is very familiar to you from John 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The other is from George Orwell, and it's probably one of the most widely quoted sentences that I have read anyway in encountering political language. Political language, this is from Politics and the English Language, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. Oh, and then the third one, which comes up all the time if you look on the internet, 1984 is not an instruction manual. I'm delighted to be back at the University of Waikato and in Hamilton, which is, in my view, one of my favorite places on earth. And I would like to thank Professors Cowrie and McKim for inviting me. Also, Fulbright of New Zealand and the U.S. State Department for making this trip possible. The Fulbright in New Zealand have been very accommodating, both on this trip and on my previous Fulbright in 2013, and it's like coming home again, only this time in the summer. Last time we were here in the winter, and it's hard to say which is best, since we have been experiencing Cyclone Gita on and off for the past week, so challenge exists. I'll tell you the thesis of this, but before I get to I'll tell you the thesis first and then a side comment. The thesis of this talk is that a democratic society depends on the pervasive truth and trust. Our U.S. president the president of the U.S. has the role of truth teller in chief. The example of our current president as liar in chief contributes to the unraveling of public trust and of the integrity that ties society together. Citizens of any country have an obligation to seek and speak the truth. And so we will be talking about truth in language, but truth in writing in particular. I want to make one observation which I learned yesterday that really surprised me. We had a seminar with teachers from the schools in this area yesterday, and we were talking about how students get taught to write and what they're allowed and not allowed to write about. And I asked whether the students spent a lot of time on their electronic devices, and was assured that they did. So I said, well, then they're writing all the time. And the teacher said they don't think that what they're sending on the internet is writing. That they only apparently associate writing with some formal means of putting words into a document that is identified as an essay or whatever. So I found that a very interesting and somewhat surprising view of writing, because a lot of what I'm going to be dealing with in this talk is writing by any means and in any mode, which today would include far more electronic communication than it would the written word. So, in this talk, I'll address the following topics. Definitions of truth, but I may cut that short on the assumption that we all know truth when we see it, or when we think we do anyway. Assumptions about truth that govern everyday transactions. George Orwell's Politics in the English Language in 1984 as evidence of how language is manipulated and degraded for political purposes. Then beautiful language with a digression into the new translation of the Odyssey. Ugly language, and if we have time, fake news and how to detect fake news. If time doesn't permit in the body of this talk on detecting fake news, I may be able to work it into the follow-up commentary. So, here we go. Unfortunately, that is true, although, as my sister-in-law points out, all of these are probably artificial constructs. But if you have a president who is lying much of the time, and I will refer you now to a website called PolitiFacts. This is an excellent website. It has a catalog day by day of Trump's tweets, and then they're categorized by topic, and it has another analysis of his lies with the actual factual evidence that contradicts the lies. Other websites that are useful for this is one called Union of Concerned Scientists, which has many essays on correcting facts, and another one called Econofacts, which is also useful. These, by the way, would be good for teachers in various fields in any subject, because the little essays that are on these websites are written for a general audience. They're written in useful language, and they're not highly technical, yet they're accurate, so that they're very reliable little summaries of evidence on given points. When I looked at Google on January 7, there were 837 million hits on the word truth. I'm not going to present you with all of these, fortunately, but I've decided to use a pretty common definition of truth as the correspondence of language or thought to an independent reality, one that can be verified. This is known as the correspondence theory. We know that the reality of what we see or experience becomes the basis of many of the observations and best practices in science, education, and everyday life. We also know, I think, as writers, that if you have a mistake in fact in something that you write, even if everything else is accurate, people will not trust the whole document. That one absence of truth, even if it's unintentional, causes people to question the accuracy of the whole piece. So one thing that students need to be taught, I think, is check it out. Make sure that you can verify whatever it is you're talking about. The following discussion comes from a book by a colleague of mine, Michael P. Lynch, called Truisms called True to Life, Why Truth Matters. This is from MIT Press in 2005. Truth is objective. Just because we believe something doesn't make it true, and just because it's true doesn't mean we will believe it. This is part of the debate over alternative facts and evidence that people overlook. I think in New Zealand, two things that have become apparent to me while we've been here are climate change is real. Climate change is going on all over the country. We are here in what is winter in Boston, our hometown. Today, the temperature in Boston is 70 degrees. This never happens, but it's happening. 2 weeks ago, they had 6 inches of snow. You can't. It's weird. I've been told that hurricane or Cyclone Gita is an aberration at this time of year. We have plenty of evidence for something that climate change deniers simply say, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up. Likewise, as Michael Lynch says, the height of Mount Everest is not a matter of whether we believe it to be a certain height. You can measure it. Okay. Truth is good. At least, I think, would we not all, is there anyone here who would dispute that? I know this is supposed to be a controversial talk, but that's indisputable, right? Now, interpretations of the truth and variations on these interpretations may provide a lot of dissent. But it's good to believe what is true. We distinguish truth from falsity because we need a way of separating correct beliefs from incorrect beliefs or statements. We need even the word true has an evaluative dimension. If we say something is true, we generally mean that in a positive way. And if we say it's untrue or that a person is not telling the truth, that is negative. In similar ways, the uses of the word true or false are both positive or negative. Truth is worthy of inquiry. Isn't that why we think we are educating students? Besides, for a job, are we not trying to give them the fundamental tools to find the truth in their own disciplines and to eliminate falsehood and to continue to work for what is verifiable and knowable? That truth is a worthy goal of inquiry, and also truth is worth knowing for its own sake. That doesn't mean there is only one truth, or that only pure reason can access the truth, or that truth is mysterious, and that only some people can know the truth, but others cannot. Nor does it mean, in fact, that we should pursue the truth at all costs. I think that for society to run in some ways smoothly, we are obliged to tell white lies. The prime example of that is if you ask your significant other, does this dress make me look fat? Do you really want to know? I'd like to also bring up a few principles of everyday truthful communication, because I would say truth is the foundation of all human relationships, whether they're personal, social, legal, or business. In most cases, they're so embedded in everyday transactions that we take them for granted, and we're really lucky that we can do that. Consider truth in education. The basic transaction of any public speech or any school session can be interpreted as follows. I, the speaker, am telling you the truth. You, the audience, are also participants in the dialogue, and you are expecting to hear the truth, as are your students. We say what we mean, and we mean what we say. If, I might add, we're being ironic, we send signals by way of tone, or as my mother-in-law used to say, joke in parentheses, so that people will know we are being ironic. And apparently, part of the trouble on the internet with people mistaking truth for fiction is sometimes people are reading satires on the internet and they think that whatever it is really true. We also speak the same language. We're all speaking English. And am I pronouncing this right? Kia ora? Kia ora. All right. That's, even that pronunciation is my deterrent. I once had a long paragraph written in Kiwi slang that I had got from the internet, and then I thought, no way am I going to say that. Slang has too many ambiguous connotations, and I could get into trouble. However, I have learned through communication with Professor McKim not to sign off messages with Cheerio, because that means a small cocktail sausage. In the States, in the States that would mean goodbye. A truthful context validates the speaker. I'm here because you invited me. Fulbright is sponsoring it. These are all reputable, and we all assume that this is an ethical and reputable context. Credentials and experience also validate the invitation and the truth of the presentation. Although you could say, and this would think about your own vita. A vita is managed news, the record of your professional career, which you summarize on a statement, only presents the good news. We don't put on vitas grants we don't get, publications that work that we may have submitted that was rejected, so that when you look at a vita, it is very positive. We have jobs that we have, not jobs that we were declined. We have all kinds of positive information, and why not? I mean, vitas are too long, and they would be too long if we put in all the nuts and bolts. That could be the basis for a series of true stories or fiction, but it doesn't belong on a professional resume. Okay. We move on to politics in the English language. You know this man, I presume, George Orwell, whose name in itself is a pseudonym a lie, or is a pseudonym simply an alternative identity? We know him as George Orwell. His real name was Eric Blair, but that is not what we think of when we think of this man. He has asserted in Politics in the English Language that the great enemy of clear language is insincerity. I don't know whether you can tell that in student writing, but very often if somebody is writing something that purports to be the truth and they've made up some element, I was talking with Tracy Slaughter about this the other day, if they've made up some element, it's not going to sound right, and it's hard to tell in the abstract what that is, but it will be like just some little slip of either information or intonation that will be a clue that this is fake rather than the real thing. Orwell was also very concerned in both 1984 and Politics in the English Language with what he calls ugly writing. He analyzes bad, ugly writing, which is often verbose, unclear, full of obfuscations and distractions, meaningless words. And I've seen this in writing emanating now from the White House. Meaningless words acquire alternative meanings to become the defense of the indefensible. Thus, pacification acquires an alternative meaning that's used in war after war after war. This is from Orwell. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, huts set on fire with incendiary bullets, and that's considered pacification. That was a term used in the United States throughout the Vietnam War, and it's a problem term. 1984 was eerily prescient of today's political climate in the States. I gather that things are on a much more even keel in New Zealand, that you have a prime minister that people love and admire, that you have a functioning political system where things get done, and you expect civil discourse with action to follow. So I may be talking in a utopian context to people who are really happy about what's going on, and yet because of the pervasive presence of the United States in the world, it won't hurt to have to hear this critique. I might add that my research for this talk has been very extensive and the most depressing research I've ever done. It's very depressing to reread 1984. Have you all read it at some point or another? Recently or in the more remote past? Both. Okay, I won't reiterate the plot of 1984. I think you know it. You know the dismal party hack Winston Smith. You know that his job was to rewrite history, to both obliterate the real past and to substitute a fake past that is at variance with what the real events were, to rewrite history in such a way that people living in the present wouldn't even have recourse to evidence that showed that the world used to be different than the world that they know. Now, it took him and the, quote, the oppositely named Ministry of Truth years to complete this project. They figured it would even take beyond his lifetime. So maybe 50 or 75 years it might take to rewrite history. If you were using today's electronic means, you might not even have 1984. It could happen overnight in the speed with which the language can be transmitted. I don't know about the ability to erase the historic artifacts, but the speed with which communication can be changed today makes a lot of the rapid change of language and the rapid arguments proceed much faster than they had in the past. That may be part of the trouble. If we were living in the days where messages had to be transmitted by sea ships carrying the letters, if you had even resorting to messages being sent in bottles that would float across the ocean, that might not be such a bad thing. We might be less obsessed, or at least obsessed with the news. We might not. A president who was sitting in the White House tweeting would have a very limited audience if you had conventional means. Unfortunately, the way that these tweets can be transmitted is so rapid that each one supersedes the previous one, and he contradicts himself all the time, so that one lie supplants another, and the news media are hard-pressed to keep up with this rapid change that's going on, and it's chaotic, among other things. Likewise, in the United States, something has happened that I never thought would happen in my lifetime. On December 12, 15, 2017, senior officials at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were ordered not to use the following words in preparing budget proposals and supporting materials for things that would receive government funding. Here are the words: vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, science-based. The suggested alternative that the government has now for science-based is CDC bases its recommendations on science in consideration with community standards and wishes. If you control that language, among the consequences in funding proposals are the following. Some of the National Center for HIV/AIDS, viral hepatitis, sexually transmitted diseases, and TB prevention is working on ways to prevent HIV among transgender people and to reduce health disparities. If you can't use that language, you can't get funding that would aid that population. If you can't use that language, you can't get funding for stem cell research. There are many implications of the control that language represents. And this is probably shorthand now for the kind of language and thought control you would have in the current government. The principles of Newspeak that Orwell appends to 1984 are all designed to make language diminished. The nuances are left out of language. The subtleties are left out of language. Alternative ways of expressing anything are omitted if you simplify the language. And if you simplify the language to the extent that you cut out all but kind of literal expressions like here is the dog, and the dog has to refer to a literal dog, so you wouldn't have dog days, presumably. You cut out both the beauty and the possibility of lots of different communication. That was the aim in promoting Newspeak, that people would become thought slaves of the state, and they would not have an independent mind. This is all antithesis to education as we know it. By shrinking the vocabulary, stripping words of their unusual and ambiguous meanings, Newspeak also invents new words out of parts of old words. Newspeak itself is one. CrimeThink is another. CrimeThink in 1984 is a synonym for liberty and equality, which would mean that if that's part of the meaning of that, you don't have liberty or equality anymore. It is a crime to think those words. Euphemisms are used to conceal double meanings, not only the ones there, but a forced labor camp is called a joy camp. The Ministry of Peace is really the Ministry of War, and so on. The intention is to make speech automatic so that people really don't think about what they're saying. It's also to make it ugly. The people in 1984 quack like ducks, and it's called duck speak, in fact. I want to compare this to the possibilities present in the new translation of the Odyssey, where beautiful language is truth and truth is beauty. Orwell himself could count on emphatic readers who in 1984 had just witnessed a major world war, or in the year 1940, in the year that 1984 was published, which was 1947. They had just gone through a major world war, full of all of the ugliness, both of war and the language that it was couched in. Had the war been successful for the Germans, it might have been another blow to the death of the English language, in which we have Shakespeare, Dickens, and Tracy Slaughter's work. Fortunately, the language is still here, and I think part of that is the result of the, in my view, positive outcome of World War II. When we look at the Odyssey, there have been 60 translations in English in recent years. to characterize Odysseus in the opening line of the Odyssey, which Homer renders as polytropos in ancient Greek. You'd think by now they would have agreed on a term, or at least have reached some agreement. But no, look at the range of descriptors. These are all for that word, polytropos. I don't know Greek. How many people here, are there Greek speakers or not people here who know Greek?
I can find my way to the toilets and
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that will get you. Okay, here are some of the terms that appear in these translations. Prudent, crafty, by long experience tried, full of resources, much versed, the cunning hero, of many fortunes, tossed to and fro by fate, many-sided man, deep, sagacious, skilled in expedients, adventurous, shifty, ingenious, so wary and wise, of many devices, restless, clever, never at a loss, of wide-ranging spirit, of many wiles, of twists and turns, cunning. Okay, so the new translator, who's the first woman to do this, Emily Wilson, looked at all these translations and came up with her own word for polytropos, which is complicated. That's the word. It has some overlapping connotations with all of these, but it's not exactly any of the above. So here is her translation for the first few lines. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. Okay, the choice of complicated involves sound, 4 syllables, 2 troches, as well as sense. Like all word choices in any language, native or in translation, each word, used individually or in combination, is highly significant, full of nuance and resonance. Using a wide repertoire of language allows many options as we try to speak the truth. Wilson herself comments on the process of translation. If you're going to admit that stories matter, then it matters how we tell them, and that exists on the level of microscopic word choice, as well as on the level of which story are we going to pick to start off with, and then what exactly is that story. The whole question of what is the story is going to depend on the language, the words you use. In the case of the Odyssey, she feels that the original story had been bent out of shape by successive translations. I'll give you a different example. When you think of the person, Julius Caesar, where does your information come from? Shakespeare. Pardon?
How about you do as well, and René Goscinny, Asterix.
Okay. So we've got Shakespeare and Asterix, neither of which are the original documents, and yet these are the characters that we know and perhaps love, and we don't go back to Shakespeare's source, which may or may not have been Plutarch's Lives, and Plutarch himself was known to have some disparity between whatever the actual evidence was and his characters that he presents in Plutarch's Lives. So whatever the real Julius Caesar was is not the Julius Caesar that we know and love or find perplexing. We get those from intermediate sources. That's true for a lot of other information we get. So when Wilson was translating the Odyssey, she went back, as you would, to the original Greek, partly because she felt that these intermediate translations had gotten it out of the word is true. If you true a piece of wood or something, you get it back into shape where you have tight right angle corners and so on. So she is interesting use of the word true. She's truing the document as she is trying to tell the truth about the subject. This is 6 lines from the Odyssey that I just read you. 163 characters, precise, metrical, evocative, intense. That could be a tweet. You could have 12 lines now in the longer tweet. In this case, however, 12,104 more lines flesh out the story. A tweet is technically a unit of empty space waiting to be filled with meaning. Yet by restricting the message to a few characters, tweet users have a lot of pressure to get it right the first time. I'm not sure that's what tweet users actually do. I think they shoot from the lip and figure out whether it made any sense afterward. To conserve characters, tweets also use a lot of abbreviations. If you look online, you can find pages of tweet abbreviations. Do you know some of these? HAGN, have a good night. TLDR, too long, didn't read. These say they're back to newspeak, aren't they? They save space as they curtail both thought and originality. In this hasty medium, even lovemaking is reduced to 4 unromantic letters. IWSN. Would you care to guess on that one? I want sex now. So you have, if you have a lot of extra characters to play with if you use only these abbreviations. So think of the difference. Somehow the Odyssey gets us in there in a very evocative language to the point that summary of what's going to come is in those 6 lines. But the language is beautiful. It's metrical. This is language that you can listen to, as poetry is in general. You can hear that. And with the movement of the Odyssey, where it is, in fact, about a journey, you want the movement of the language to be reflected in that reflects the movement that's going on in the story. It's tightly controlled by the translator as it was by the original author. I will only give you one example of a Donald Trump tweet. He has debased the language intensely. His tweets reiterate with insulting adjectives: loser, dumb, terrible, stupid, weak, dopey, lightweight, incompetent, pathetic, disgusting, the worst. And unfortunately, because these tweets are picked up by the media, they get repeated. And they get repeated in contexts that may be critical of them, like the New York Times, which is a highly reliable source of news. But the language has become corrupted and tainted by the abuse of the language in the current political discourse. I find myself comparing tweets with the Declaration of Independence and some of the language in America's foundational documents. The rhythm of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a wonderful phrase. And it's a philosophical phrase. What does the pursuit of happiness mean? We could discuss this or argue about it for a long time. Just one tweet. Actually, throughout my life, this is Trump on the 6th of January this year, my 2 greatest assets have been mental stability and being, like, really smart. You wonder why he put like in there. That like is a verbal tick. I mean, those are extra letters. But do teenagers here have various verbal ticks? Like? Are there other ones besides like?
You know?
That must be universal. Anything? As? Just as all by itself? Oh, okay. Okay, we know these. And they just fill up space. At the University of Connecticut, from which I recently retired, in the business school, before students were going out to be interviewed, they had them practice conversation with a mentor, and they were fined for every verbal tick they used because it doesn't sound grown up. And as an English professor, I was trying to get they didn't write that way, but they spoke that way. And I was trying to get them to not do it, but I was trying to be polite. So I asked them you can ask people to think about what they're saying, but they don't hear it. They use it so automatically that they just edit it out when they speak it. So what I found myself saying was, think about the next year when you will graduate and how your language may change as you do this so that it sounds like adult professional discourse. I don't know whether that worked. I didn't say you're talking like an idiot. And I didn't really mean idiot, but you're talking without thinking when you use that kind of language. And it's the same goes true. We had a discussion in yesterday's seminar about profanity. The same is true with repeated use of four-letter words. Most four-letter words are anatomically impossible, or they don't mean what they say anyway. They're the allegedly shocking equivalent of verbal tics. And if students are writing with a lot of four-letter words, it precludes, let's say they have a character who swears all the time, it precludes more diverse and more interesting language. And they need to grow up enough to see that the four-letter words are not moving their writing along, or they're not communicating what the students really think they're saying. It would be nice if the authors of tweets would have the same kind of consideration. Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker of January 27th last year said, he has an article called Orwell's 1984 and Trump's America. There is nothing subtle about Trump's behavior. Primitive, atavistic, and uncomplicatedly brutal. And Trump had only been in office for about 3 days when he wrote this. It's gotten worse. Pure Big Brother crude. From rage, vanity, and vengeance. He lies. He repeats the lie. And his listeners either cower in fear, stammer in disbelief, or try to see how they can turn the lie to their own benefit. Orwell understood pure, raging, authoritarian id. Trump's pure, raging, brute authoritarianism rests on lies told so often and so repeatedly that fighting the lie becomes not simply more dangerous, but more exhausting than repeating it. Orwell saw, to his credit, that the act of falsifying reality is only secondarily a way of changing perceptions. It is, above all, a way of asserting power. The problem with it for common discourse is, if the tweeter-in-chief is doing this, it gives license for other people to do it as well. And so the trickle-down theory of horrific communication is in operation as this lack of respect for your audience, the imprecision of vocabulary, the telling lies and having them masquerade under the guise of truth goes on. I wish it was so nice to be here when President Obama was president. Obama was elegant as a speaker. He was getting back to the discourse of our founding fathers. I wish I could say mothers, but they weren't. Founding Fathers in the eloquence and precision of discourse. Part of that came because Obama read books, and he read good books. And I think that other than people hearing eloquent language, reading it can imbue people, as we know from teaching children, from speaking to little kids on up. Reading provides a matrix that can be very rich and enriching and provide expansion of thought and speech as well. If you read, you have to think about other ways of expressing not just the ideas, but other voices. And those other voices are uttered by speakers who may be very different from you, but who are eloquent. So when I was here before, it was a source of pride to think of the way that our Commander-in-Chief was also speaking in polite but measured, precise, thoughtful, articulate, humane, generous language. So let us hope that it won't have died before been stamped out by the current level of political discourse. I think the seeds of civil discourse and language have been sowed. They exist around the world, so they don't have to be overpowered by a temporary hiatus in the speaking. Now, I have material prepared for how you can help students find, detect truth from falsity in what they hear. And I'll just mention these. We may, if we have more time as the discussion goes on, I can add this. But I think too many people, at least too many students and maybe others, are swayed by what you see on the internet and what you read. Especially in the United States now, we are being inundated by Russian bots that spew millions of messages to thousands of and millions of recipients and disseminate both fake news and ugly language at the same time. And these became rumors that were circulated during the last presidential election, that Hillary Clinton was running a child pornography ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. This came from a Russian source, but people don't necessarily consider the source. I think there are probably people in this room who are better equipped to tell you how to find the true origin of a source than I am. So I will defer that information to other people. Read beyond the headlines. I think there's a very interesting book by a man named Nicholas Carr, C-A-R-R, called The Shallows. And what he's talking about is the way that reading has changed since the age of the internet. He said he used to read like a deep-sea diver, where with the text he would plumb the depths of it, he would sink into the text, he would read with a luxuriant enjoyment of the words, the structure, the syntax, and it would be a really powerful experience. He said, since reading online has become common, and he's doing it, he said now it's like skimming across the surface of a text on jet skis. Hence the term the shallows. It doesn't mean the depth isn't there, but it does mean that how many of us read the newspapers online, for instance? And when you read the paper, how fast are you going?
A lot faster than when I'm reading it in my hand.
Right. Why is that? It could be the same news.
So much of it.
There's so much of it, exactly. We think, oh, there's this long, this bulletin from the New York Times has 40 different articles I could read. The actual paper probably has 400. But somehow we think we need to read it all, and so we have to hurry through some of the major things. And it's easy to skim because you can keep flicking through as you're going. So part of it is the headlines are set up as clickbait. The language is provocative so people can look at them, and maybe they don't read beyond the headlines. Often you need to read beyond the headlines, and that is a practice that we need to counteract in the schools. But, you know, we get into this insidiously, don't we? Nobody taught any of us, I bet, how to read something online. How do you learn? You just do it. Am I right? And it used to be in schools that when you're taught to read, you're also taught to how to read a text, not just going from left to right, but also where you might find the main idea, where you're looking for the supporting information. We do this as teachers of writing. But when we're reading online, we look at the headlines, we get the lead paragraph, and then maybe we read the rest, and maybe we go on to the next headline. Check the author. Sometimes the authors are fake. Sometimes there is no identifiable author. It may be set up anonymously so that you can't find out who wrote it. I have read a definition of a horse, or of a camel rather, that is a horse invented by a committee. And if you have an author, you can Google the author. Very often you can find that author on Wikipedia and through some other sources. If it's a university author, they will have a bio on the university website. You can check out their credentials. You can do this with many people, but not with everybody. Look at the supporting sources. There are a couple of sites for teachers to use in teaching, I think, you could use it for any level of teacher, of student, but particularly for high school and college students, teaching their a whole curriculum on how teachers can do the things that are identified here. Checking the date. You want whatever is current, but you may need to go back to an earlier iteration of the subject in order to know whether the older one might actually be better. Is it a joke? It might be satire. It's hard to know maybe when you just look at the words, so you may need more supporting evidence or some other document, some other article on the same subject to check out with the one that you're looking at. Check your biases. It seems to have been cut off a little bit, but I think I'm guilty of this, and I don't know whether the rest of you are. I know what I'd like to believe, and I'm more hospitable toward sources that corroborate my beliefs than I would be toward sources that don't. Now, what if you have a climate change denier? That person will simply say, as I said before, don't bother me with the facts. I believe that this isn't occurring. And even if it's occurring, it's hard to believe that you could deny something that you can see with your own eyes, but people do this. Also ask the experts. This is put out, I believe, by the National Library Council. Ask a librarian, it says, or consult some other expert if you are uncertain. I think we're due for a break, but why